the overall conclusion, of course, is that war has been characteristic of human societies for thousands of years, even before the coming of the state and the making of modern kinds of war. And as I was writing the book, of course, Putin invaded Ukraine. As the book was being published, Netanyahu was invading Gaza. It would be very hard to make out a case that somehow or other in the 21st century, we've got all that behind us. Now we're going to find ways to collaborate. We're going to sit down around a table when we have an issue. It's not going to happen.
Welcome, everyone. It's Jeff from the Burning Archive, and I have a very special guest today. It's Richard Overy, the British historian, renowned for his histories of war. Thank you for joining me today, Richard.
My pleasure.
Today we really want to discuss your recent book, Why War? Of course, there are many of your books that would be wonderful to discuss, but really keen to discuss that one in particular. And in Why War, you investigate the various explanations scholars have offered for why we fight wars. You cover the whole of human history, even hominid history, and you sort of come to the conclusion that war is normal and its causes are many. This might be a challenging finding for many. I wonder if we could perhaps start with your observations on the idea that at some time in history, before agriculture, before the state, or sometime in the future, we can live without war.
Well, I think sometime in the future is quite difficult to predict because historians are very bad at predicting what's going to happen, better at looking at what has happened. I think that for many people, there is still this idea developed first by the French philosopher Rousseau that somehow or other the primitive savage was not really a savage, they didn't fight, but fighting is something which civilized people do. And that's something that anthropologists took up in the 20th century. They were very keen to show that early tribal societies, for example, or hunter-gatherers, were not bellicose. It's really the modern state that's made war. Now, I'm very skeptical of that view. I think that it's extremely unlikely that over a long period of hominid existence, 2, 3, 4, 500,000 years, that there were moments when for self-defense, for greed, for anxiety, for whatever motive, the human communities fought each other. Not, of course, like regular wars today with, armies and the state paying and organizing it, but skirmishes, ambushes, brief fights, even ritual fights, perhaps, between them. But the idea that somehow or other fighting only began 6,000 years ago with the coming of the state seems to me to be completely implausible. And there's plenty of archaeological evidence to show, indeed, that violence between groups already went on 10, 20,000 years before the present. And I think we can probably stretch that back. Archaeological evidence is difficult to find for that earlier period. But I think that's no reason for assuming that it didn't happen. I think it's very difficult to imagine human beings all collaborating together happily for 100,000 years or more, and then discovering that when they needed something, they would fight.
Still, the hope lives eternal, I guess, doesn't it? Perhaps that's the dream of the perpetual peace. Indeed, your book even includes some of the evidence from Australia of evidence of that kind of combat, I guess, over time as well, like before 1788. The first broad discipline that you look at is biology, evolutionary biology, with the idea of, war is in our genes. And that's one of the, I guess, the more simplistic explanations of why we fight war. But you come up with a more sophisticated idea, which is the idea from evolutionary biology of inclusive fitness. Could you talk to that a bit and what that means?
Well, the idea that war is in our genes was popular at the beginning of the 20th century and then very soon discredited as people began to know more about the function of genes. Um, uh, but modern evolution biologists have been very attracted to an idea that was first applied, in fact, not to humans, but to animal species, of inclusive fitness. And that's really about how you protect your near kin, how you expand your gene pool, if you like. How do you do that? Well, you do it, of course, in a natural way. But the argument is that there are times when you fight a neighboring clan, which is a threat to your kin group. You may seize their women and kill the men, and the women will be added to your kin group, and you will expand your gene pool that way. In other words, that the critical thing is somehow or other protecting biologically the community of which you are a member. And that's been used by evolution biologists as a better way, perhaps, of understanding the evolution of war. Once violence between communities had become an embedded part of protecting yourself and your kin group, then it becomes something that's regarded as evolutionary advantageous by human communities. And once they have that, they don't let go. And I found that quite a persuasive argument.
So the idea is you protect your community or your immediate group rather than protect the reproduction of your species. Is that essentially the
No, indeed,
idea?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, human beings are the only species that regularly kill each other in large
Yeah.
numbers, in fact. But I think that has really ancient roots. I think it does go back to this period when, small and vulnerable hominin communities were trying to live in a variety of very different environments, often very challenging environments, and so on. And they would find themselves, of course, at certain points feeling insecure, frightened, threatened by others, and so on. And the response was to protect yourself by using violence. And as I said, that becomes, I think, something that it becomes embedded in evolutionary terms. No, you don't think in terms of protecting your entire species. You think in terms of protecting yourself. And the theory continues by arguing that what you find in these early communities are what are called altruists, that they're people who are prepared to go out and do the fighting, protect the kin. They might sacrifice themselves in the process of doing that. But some animal species do exactly the same thing. Some of them become altruists when there's a threat, an eagle overhead or whatever it is. And I think in the case of human communities, that's extends the argument a bit, and I think also makes a very considerable sense. It also explains how, even in communities well before the state, you began to develop, evidently, a warrior elite. You began to develop men whose job was to protect the kin group and to do so in organized ways. In the historic period, you can find some very obvious examples, and the ones I use, I think, are Sparta and the Vikings, where in both cases, fighting was embedded in their community and their culture. It's what they did. But you can also see the evidence from Neolithic times, pre 5,000, 6,000 years ago, where you have graves with warriors buried with their weapons, where you have evidence, of course, that the weapons are being used in one way or another. And I think that, this is perhaps a natural development. I think at first it's almost certain that almost all the men in the village or the community, whatever, would be involved in the fighting. That's true of Aboriginal groups in Australia. But eventually, the more successful warrior would become the boss. Others would find ways or excuses for not sacrificing themselves, and very soon you develop a warrior elite. And I think the important thing, of course, is that warrior elite, is initially biologically very important. It is your means of surviving, not just against predators, for example, but against other human communities.
And that connects to the next chapter in your book, which is about psychology, where you do talk about the male warrior ethos or the valuation of the male warrior in various emotional valuation of male warriors in various communities. But you also talk about in-group, out-group dynamics, the dehumanization of the enemy in various ways. What were some of the best psychological explanations of war that you found in your research?
Well, I mean, the evolutionary psychology is closely related to evolutionary biology, because evolutionary psychologists argue that, again, over a long time, human beings developed in their mind. They compartmentalized their mind into various little boxes, if you like. One of the boxes was that, at moments of crisis or fear or whatever, you will resort to war or violence as one way of protecting your species, not your species, sorry, one way of protecting your kin, your immediate group. But social psychologists have developed a sophisticated argument, really, about the importance for human communities of dividing us into them and us. Into thinking of us as being the important group that needs to be protected and so on, and them, it's the others, the threat, potential threat, and that division between them and us can often lead to a situation in which we think of the other really as as almost subhuman or a demonic threat of some kind. And there are plenty of evidence from tribal communities where they believe that the neighboring tribe is engaging in magic, for example, and that is damaging the interests of your own tribe. And so you get together, all the men grab their spears and they go off and they butcher the neighboring tribe. And I think that this social psychological view that somehow or other we are capable always of thinking of the other as a threat, which might at some point have to be confronted violently. And that's true today too, the way in which in the 20th century too, people would divide up into them and us. You thought of the Germans thought of the French as their eternal enemy. The British thought of the Germans as aggressive military people who needed to be taught a lesson, and so on and so on. So it's not just an explanation for ancient warfare, it's an explanation you can use today as well.
Indeed, right into the 21st century, and we see
Indeed.
so many examples every day, really, and both with interstate wars as well as internal social conflicts, I guess, as well.
Oh, indeed,
Yeah. But you also speculate in this chapter on psychology about the importance of the emotional value attached to being the male warrior, and could you just expand on that a little bit? Because I mean, I guess we see this, for example, even in some of the rhetoric, for example, of some the American Secretary of War. Almost there's that. I think he explicitly talks about the warrior spirit.
Yeah, I mean, you can still see it today, but I mean, it's important to apply it right back to the historic period, because the warrior elite soon became a dominant force in every society, and there's almost no society in which that warrior elite does not develop, and the warrior elite is comprised of men who not only feel psychologically that they're committed somehow to protecting their community, but who feel an emotional involvement in war. They actually, in many cases, like war, and I think that's something that I think many people find difficult to understand or to grasp. I mean, plenty of examples from the Middle Ages, for example, where a king or a prince might be a rather reluctant leader and not actually fancy war very much. There are his knights and his barons telling him, "Look, we've got to do something. We've got to go off and fight. That's what we're here for." And of course, the king reluctantly leads them off in warfare. I think that there's a strong tendency to assume that this division between men and women, what men do, what women do, is all nonsense, and that we need to be able to see men as as potentially pacifist. Well, of course, that's true. But the evidence historically shows that all the way through the historic period, and probably well before that too, the warrior elite was one way of becoming, somebody who had real esteem in that society, somebody who could be valued, perhaps above anybody else, because here are people who are willing to sacrifice themselves. And you find that even in the Second World War, the rhetoric is, that the people who are going out and sacrificing themselves for the community, it's an honorable activity, and they are honored even when they're killed.
And that motif of heroic sacrifice is so present in even commemorations of war today, isn't it? You also talk about anthropology in culture in the book, but I'm keen to talk about the second part of the book where you really talk about, I guess, the role of human cognition or history or social causes of war. And the first of those is a very common explanation for war: resources. The idea that the war is about, it's all about the oil, or war is a racket, or we've got to get those rare earths in Donald Trump's language. But you find this explanation, although very common, lacking in some ways, even in the prime examples of the Gulf Wars and the 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union. Can you tell us about what the limits of explaining war by resources are?
Well, I mean, I use some examples from the 20th century where the standard Marxist view, of course, is that capitalism causes war. And that therefore there must be wars that you can prove, the interests of capitalism, and that's why they're waged. Even the First World War can often be seen in that way. And I think what I was arguing really, I think in the book, is that, this doesn't really stand up, partly because there's very little evidence that capitalists actually do want war, or actually promote it, or force politicians to make war. That limitation needs to be borne in mind. But I'm not against the idea of resources causing war. And in fact, if we go back through history, of course, obviously resources do attract warfare. The tribe or the small state or the principality that sees the enemy's got access to particular resources of one kind or another, and you make war in order to be able to seize those resources. So I don't have any problem with seeing resources as an important element in any explanation about warfare. It often goes hand in hand though with something else. Whether it's power politics, whether it's the pursuit of security, and resources in some way will be a bonus. There are peoples that made war for resources. The Vikings are a good example. Where they went, they seized whatever they could and sold it to other markets. In the modern day, I think the idea that resources explain a decision for war is often strongly criticized. Well, the Gulf Wars, which you mentioned, one example, but I think in my book, I do say the Gulf Wars are an example of resource war. There's no doubt that protecting one of the world's most important sources of oil was a priority for the West. It's a priority now for other countries, priority for China today. And so there will be times where resources become the primary motive, not just simply value added afterwards.
A related idea, I guess, is to talk about the military-industrial complex in the United States. I guess a sort of coalition of interests, all of whom the war machine of the modern state. Would you say the same thing about that sort of idea that it's not really a complete idea?
Well, I mean, again, the problem I think is clearly military-industrial complexes exist. In every modern state, there's a relationship between industry that produces weapons and the military that use them. But the argument, to extend the argument that the people who make the armaments think the more war the better, is very difficult to demonstrate. I mean, they make money because states are insecure and they want to buy state-of-the-art weapons, and they'll pay a lot of money for it, and business is very happy with that. But when it comes to actual war, situation might be rather different. In the Second World War, businesses that were making weapons had a ferocious tax regime imposed on them. Capital gains could not be made. They were appealed to on patriotic terms. And it seems rather paradoxical, because you're busy making weapons and you think the war might be a good thing if you make weapons. But actually, I think in many cases, these businesses would rather make weapons and sell them to states that are insecure, but not actually have a war.
That's a very wise observation. The next explanation you look at is belief, and I guess many Marxists or many materialists, people who like to explain things by material realities, might discount explanations of the role of ideas or religion or ideologies in explaining war. What's your judgment on the role of belief in causing war, with especially the key examples, I guess, that you discussed, the Crusades and the Cold War?
Yeah. Well, I take a very different view. I think belief is very important. And I think you can trace it back historically a long way to states or tribal communities where they have a cosmology, like the Aztecs, for example, in which waging war was something you had to do in order to protect the state from God's wrath. And the more you sacrifice, the better. So the more you made war and caught people and murdered them, the better. Now you can extend that to all kinds of other examples, the Crusades. Here, many historians argue, well, the Crusades is really about, look at the social and economic problems that, are being faced by, European knights and so on. And, here was a chance to go off and grab some land in the Middle East and so on. But I think that, the initial crusading impulse, is much more clearly religious. And indeed, the difficulties of crusading, the costs of crusading, the risks they ran in actually going to the Middle East and struggling across, desert land, it can only be explained by, their belief, first of all, that they were going to rescue Jerusalem from the Muslims, and that if they went on crusade, all their sins would be forgiven, and they would find a better place in paradise. Now, you and I might find that rather hard to understand today, but then that was not today, and I think that the social scientists who think that belief is not that important need to put themselves in a position in the history of the last 6,000 years and look at the way in which belief functioned, look at how important it was in almost all communities, and how belief could be made to legitimize war or indeed make war necessary. And that extends also, I think, to the 20th century. I mean, the example I use actually is again rather a paradoxical one. People always assume that it's fascism and communism that have beliefs and ideology and so on and so on. But I argue, of course, that the West has an ideology as well, quite a powerful one, actually, in defense of democratic liberties and so on, civil freedoms, etc., etc. And that the contest with communism is because you want to defend that way of life, your ideology against the ideology of communism. No, it didn't lead to war, luckily for everybody. But ideology is still around in the 21st century, where people, are are thinking in terms of possible warfare in defense of a particular cultural and political system. And so I think we must never put belief behind us. Belief actually can work in all kinds of ways, 6,000 years ago and today.
Indeed, I wonder sometimes whether that positive belief in the powerful ideology of the West, partly explains the sense in which some people feel disappointed that the Cold War never really ended, sort of thing. But the ideological conflict with communism finished, the security competition with communism finished, and yet the mobilization of people around the sort of democratic ideals, sometimes in conflict-ridden ways, seems to go on.
Well, the Cold War finished, but of course now the West has found another enemy, which is Islamic terrorism. And again, the opposition to that, which is also, of course, a function of belief. Their opposition to that is also, a statement of belief system. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to that. Might understand better the behavior of Western politicians if we build a bit of belief into that analysis.
Your chapter on power, always a fascinating idea, discusses the idea of hegemonic or hegemonic, depending on how you like to pronounce it, wars, and the common idea of the Thucydides trap, popularized by Graham Allison, especially as it applied to China and the United States. Are we in the 21st century doomed to wars for primacy based on motives of power between hegemonic and rising powers?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, and one, of course, is very difficult to answer as an historian. I mean, the Thucydides trap, basically, you've got strong power, and there's a rising power nearby, and the strong power wonders, what do? I go to war with it. Or the rising power thinks, what do? I go to war. Athens and Sparta were his examples. Now, today, the theory is that in the modern age, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries, there have been hegemonic powers, and they have dominated the global order for a certain period of time, but there's always going to be a rising power. The example is often used as the British Empire in the 19th century, which was the dominant global power. Then the rise of the United States made a substantial difference, a challenge to that power. Or you have the same thing, about the United States and the Soviet Union after 1945. The United States was going to be replaced by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted to be the hegemonic power. I mean, the problem about the argument is that in neither case was there a war. The British and the Americans didn't go to war. In fact, they remained firm allies, and allies still today. Nor did the Soviet Union and the United States go to war. And the argument that somehow China is now the new Soviet Union, a new rising power, and at some point, either the United States will have to fight China in order to keep it, subordinate, or China will have to fight the United States and establish its world hegemony. No, I don't think either of those scenarios is remotely likely. Not just because they're nuclear powers and wouldn't want to inflict mutual destruction on each other, but simply because there are other ways in which you can cope with this potential challenge, just as the British cope with the United States, or the United States and the Soviet Union cope with each other. I would be extremely surprised if you interviewed me in 50 years' time and that there'd been a war between China and the United States.
Do you feel the Thucydides trap is really soundly, the idea of the Thucydides trap is really soundly based on the historical record, or not?
No, I mean, I think it was a handy reference point for theorists in the late 20th century who wanted to be able to think about, what are the dangers in the global system? What happens when you've got competing hegemonic powers? Is this likely to produce war, and so on and so on? But historically, in the last 200 years, it just doesn't fit. I mean, the interesting thing is that I think a point I make in my book is that some of the major wars, particularly the First World War and the Second World War, actually started over a power attacking a small state that got in its way. Serbia, in the case of the First World War, Poland, in the case of the Second World War, and it was that then brought in all the other powers into the conflict. But that was not a conflict launched by a hegemonic power being challenged by a rising power, or vice versa.
The next question is about your chapter on security, which I guess deals with some of the common models of international politics in international relations schools, and the realist school of international relations. Many viewers of this channel will be familiar with John Mearsheimer and his sort of neo-realist school, and the idea of the security dilemma of a state doing things about its security that then threatens another and then provokes a war. I think I've summarized that correctly, I hope, Richard.
Yeah.
And I found your account of, I guess, the intellectual history of the security studies in the 20th century really helpful for understanding John Mearsheimer's ideas and perhaps some of the pitfalls of it. A very commonly viewed commentator on matters on YouTube. What's your assessment of realism or neo-realism in international relations? Is it really a realistic assessment of why states fight wars?
Well, the idea, of course, is to remain secure. In other words, not to fight a war. But the only way you can be secure, according to the realist argument, is, of course, to arm as fully as possible, to be prepared to make war if it's necessary. And that's something the United States didn't do in the 1930s. It wasn't ready to fight a war. It was extremely weakly armed. And I think post-45, a whole generation of academic political scientists were looking for ways to make sure that the United States didn't make that mistake again. So it is the biggest military spender. It is the most heavily armed state in the world, and it's assumed that will guarantee its security. And the realist argument, of course, is it's only one way of guaranteeing your security, which is to be as powerful as possible. Now, not all states can be as powerful as possible. Not all states can be heavily armed. So what do? Well, the argument, of course, is that you find ways of collaborating. You make treaties. You have agreements. You don't immediately assume that your neighbor is going to attack you. You find ways in which you mitigate the possible threat. And we can see that in the late 20th and 21st centuries, that collaboration in order to reduce insecurity has been a very important part of the global system. I think the other problem with the realist argument, of course, is that there are plenty of examples, recent examples too, of states going to war for very unrealistic motives. The United States, the decision by Germany to declare war on the United States in December 1941. There's nothing realistic about that. It's a foolish decision which brings the world's largest economy into the war, makes it very unlikely that Germany will ever win it. Or you look at Saddam Hussein and the war on Kuwait. I mean, what a gamble. There are plenty of leaders in the 19th century, 21st century who gamble. And that's not a realist position. The realistic thing is to think to yourself, can I get away with this? What do I need to be able to achieve it? What will the reaction of other powers be? And then, you might well stand back and not make that decision.
It seems to me to be based around a rational actor model on assumptions of certain clear material explanations for what the national interest is, and the way in which states act as unitary, rational actors on that basis. And I guess the history of war is very much the war and diplomacy. There's a long, long record of it being a little bit more complex than that.
Well,
Would
of
you
them
agree?
not being rational actors. I mean, the idea of the
Yeah.
rational actors always struck me as rather strange. You needed some kind of ideal uh, politician, military commander, and so on, who absolutely understands what would be the rational thing to do, what would be irrational, and so on. It just doesn't happen like that.
Mm.
There's such a long history of irrational actors. Think of Napoleon, who couldn't stop making war. Even when it was not in his interest, he continued to do so. Finally made war on Russia, which ultimately destroyed his empire. There are plenty of non-rational actors who are engaged in making war. Indeed, if we look back at the last 1,000 years, we probably find the majority were
Mm.
not very rational actors.
Mm.
The idea in the 21st century that we have, rational actors who are making realist decisions about war. Is Putin, a rational actor? Is his war on Ukraine a realistic war? Well, not a very realistic war, obviously, because it's taken him 3 years and he still hasn't won.
Mm.
I think that we need to, think more historically rather than in terms of theory.
Mm.
And the history is mixed. But what it does tell you is that realism and the rational actor are hard to find.
What's your overall conclusion then at the end of why war as to how to sum up especially as people look towards the future of perhaps mitigating the harms of war. What are the main causes of war, and how they can perhaps best be acted upon?
Well, I mean, there are many causes, of course, and I've divided them up my book into categories which we can then explain or explore.
Mm.
Um, but I mean, the overall conclusion, of course, is that war has been characteristic of human societies for thousands of years, even before the coming of the state and the making of modern kinds of war. And as I was writing the book, of course, Putin invaded Ukraine. As the book was being published, Netanyahu was invading Gaza. It would be very hard to make out a case that somehow or other in the 21st century, we've got all that behind us. Now we're going to find ways to collaborate. We're going to sit down around a table when we have an issue. It's not going to happen. The 21st century is going to see more wars. I'm very, sorry to have to say that.
Mm.
It's a pessimistic conclusion. And of course, we should make every effort possible to ensure that the peace is kept. But I think it's going to be extremely difficult. All the issues of security, power seeking, particularly security, I think, power seeking, anxiety about resources or whatever, they're not going to go away. These are going to remain elements in our history, and the elements that are capable of producing war.
Mm. But it may be that the next war, I mean, I guess I guess these days one perhaps always should say the date on which one's saying these things, but because I think Donald Tusk from Poland, the Prime Minister of Poland, has said that there's a new kind of war that is being conducted now. That there's much talk about these kind of the next war, the future of war, or World War III being around the corner. Do you think do you think there will be a World War III, or perhaps a more less sensationalist way of asking that is the next
Mm.
war going to be like the last one?
Well, I'm often asked that, and I always say no,
Mm.
there's not going to be a third world war because a third world war will
Mm.
be a nuclear war. Thermonuclear weapons are capable of destroying the planet. And I don't think there can be any nuclear power. Nuclear armed power doesn't understand that. And so I think a third world war is most unlikely. I'm often asked too about the coming of, drone warfare, remote warfare, and so on, cyber warfare, all the modern aspects of warfare that 30 or 40 years ago looked like science fiction. And I think one of the things that's worth bearing in mind is to look at the war between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, there are drones, there are hypersonic missiles and so on, but actually the war is a messy, old-fashioned war, like the Second World War and the First World War. You've got troops on the ground, you've got infantry, you've got machine guns, you've got artillery, and the fighting is at one level, fighting for territory at one level is always going to be about how you occupy it, and you occupy it in the way you did in the First World War and the Second World War. You send troops in, they occupy it, they set up their artillery, and so on and so on. And the same thing is true in Gaza. In the end, the Israeli Defense Forces, it's infantry on the ground, supported by tanks, machine guns, artillery, and of course airstrikes. And all of that was characteristic of warfare in the Second World War. So I hesitate to say that there will be a new kind of battlefield, that war in the future will be entirely different. It's capable of being entirely different, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And like the Russia-Ukraine war, I mean, there's been cases of Russian soldiers literally crawling through gas pipes and sewer pipes and that sort of thing in order to occupy territory, which is, I guess, a symbol of the earthy practicality of war as well. Talking about the Third World War takes us to the Second World War, which, of course, you've written about extensively, including in this book here, which I have with me, Blood and Ruins, The Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. I've never been a great reader of military history. Most of the military histories I've read have been yours, Richard, maybe a couple by John Keegan. But one of the things that really struck me about this book is the way you just didn't describe it as a history of the Second World War. You described it as the Great Imperial War. And I know it's a very long book and a very significant book, but I just wonder if you could just maybe comment about how your description of that event, which of course the end of which we've just commemorated as the Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945, the change of dates, the change of name, sort of reframe our understanding of its significance in our sort of common history.
Well, what I wanted to do with this was to place it into a global framework and a longer chronology. And my reference point really was the upsurge of European imperialism of the late 19th century, which encouraged national competition, which took over all those parts of the world but not yet taken over. Included Japan, that wanted to imitate the West and thought that having an empire was, in fact, one way, the best way, in fact, of becoming a major power as well. And that went on through to the First World War, which was essentially a war between empires, and on into the 1920s and 30s. And the important thing, I think, for the European powers, in particular, and for Japan, was that empire was seen as a way of establishing your status as a great power. It was a way in which you could spread your culture. It was a way in which, above all, you could get economic advantages for your population and avoid the problems of a global capitalist crisis, like the crisis of 1929. And so, rather anachronistically, because territorial empire, colonial empire, was really breaking up in the 1920s and 1930s, British and French empires, Italy, Japan, and Germany decided that building a territorial empire at the expense of other states was, the key to becoming a great power, the key to elevating your race, your people above others, a key above all to economic security. And that's why I've begun the book in 1931. Actually, I discussed the earlier period as well. The 31, with the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, or Northeast China, as you have to call it now, was the starting point, the first point where violent occupation of territory in order to boost the imperial ambitions of the home country. It was the first time that happened. It went on in China throughout the 1930s. Then Italy imitated it. Then Germany imitated it. And the British and French empires couldn't decide what to do. On the one hand, it was hard to say don't have an empire, because they had an empire, a very big one. But on the other hand, they felt that the threat from Japan, Germany, and Italy, but also the threat in the background from the Soviet Union. What do you do? And in the end, they decided that Germany was the greatest threat. And so they decided to make war with Germany in 1939 in order to protect their own global positions. And then, of course, everything unraveled. And the interesting thing, I think, is that the war between these empires was then joined by the Soviet Union and the United States. Both of them were anti-imperial powers, strongly opposed to colonialism and the European domination of the global order. And so, with their entry, it became, in a sense, an anti-imperial war in order to destroy the empires of Japan, Italy, and Germany. And as a result, Britain and France were left high and dry. In 1945, their empires really faced terminal decline, and by the 1960s, they'd gone. So that's the framework I wanted to put the book into, to make us think about it as a global phenomenon. And it was about the last stage, if you like, of 500 years of European imperialism.
Yes, it's an absolutely brilliant book. I learned so much from it. So thank you so much for writing it. And I certainly found it a wonderful book for people who aren't necessarily into kind of military history. I wonder if you have any observations. I mean, 'cause we've just passed the 80th anniversary commemorations of the end of the Second World War, the Great Imperial War in the Pacific, just a week or two, a couple of weeks ago. And there's been a lot of discussion about World War II. I guess the popular memory of World War II in recent years. What are your observations about how these commemorations have remembered, misremembered, or totally forgotten some key facets of the Second World War?
Well, I think in every case, of course, the countries that commemorate, the Second World War do so because they have their own national narrative. The United States and Britain have their own national narrative about the war, about what they contributed, that still colours the way in which they commemorate the end of the war. Russia has its own national narrative too, and Putin is very keen to demonstrate that somehow or other, it was Russia that won the war, not the West, because Russia played the largest part in defeating Hitler. Interestingly, Trump has just recently said that America was responsible for winning the First and the Second World War because American power was, so great. So remembering the end of the war can still be contentious, I think. There's very little international memory of the war. I've done a lot of podcast interviews and so on with Chinese media over the course of the last couple of months, because in China, they're remembering the war now very much as the war of 1931 to 45. So they obviously like my book for that reason. But their narrative is that China has been neglected and that they've commemorated the war extensively this year because they want the West to recognize that China had a role in the war, as indeed it did, and to think more about that and to value it. So remembering the war, it's not just a straightforward, let's commemorate the war and remember the victims and so on and so on. It's still about, how is our history to be written? How is our history to be understood? What is the popular view of our history? 80 years on, the Second World War still casts an enormous shadow over the modern world. It hasn't gone away.
I sometimes think it's almost like, say, the Trojan War for the Greeks, or computer games talk about the War of the Ancients. It's almost like the repository of all the stories that are the mythic stories that inform our culture. But World War II is almost like that at the moment.
Well, I've been asked whether, how should we remember the war when it's 100 years? And, I don't quite know what to say there. The First World War, the centenary of the First World War, had widespread coverage and so on. Actually, it faded away, I think, fairly quickly. And I wonder, with the 100th anniversary, everybody who took part will be dead. There are still a few people around who can provide interviews and oral testimony and so on. They'll all be dead. And there'll be a current generation that probably hasn't learned very much at school or university about the Second World War. So will the 100th anniversary, will it be necessary to hype it up in order to remind people of it, or will it actually begin to fade away? I wonder.
And maybe that will depend upon whether we're still living in the post-1945 world order at that point, maybe.
Indeed,
because,
yes.
it's that sort of foundation event.
Mm.
My final question is, you did mention how you'd put the framework of the narrative framework of Blood and Ruins around the sort of culminating end of 500 years of European imperialism. And I did hear on another podcast you speak about the influence of John Darwin, the historian's work, in shaping your understanding of this great imperial war. Have I got that right? And maybe could you just say a little bit about what your understanding of the importance of that work about the story of the rise and fall of global empires is?
Well, I mean, John Darwin is the premier historian writing in English about exactly that. I mean, there were other historians too who influenced me a lot. Martin Thomas, historian of French Empire, for example, who was a colleague of mine at Exeter. Rana Mitter, whose pioneering book on China's war with Japan, it also forced everybody, I think, to think much more globally about the nature of the war. I mean, John Darwin, has looked at precisely what I'm talking about, that 500 years, of course, and looked at the way in which it's developed and so on, and its final unraveling. I mean, he didn't like my thesis very much because he said that Italian, Japanese, and German imperialism in the 1930s was not like the imperialism that he'd been describing. But I think he's misjudged that. I mean, I think it is and was deliberately an extension of exactly that imperialism. And it's exactly what Mussolini and Hitler and the Japanese argued. Exactly what they said.
I know you have just published another book recently, which I think you discussed with Pascal Lataz on his neutrality studies channel. Do you want to just maybe briefly mention that, or it and any other upcoming projects of yours?
Yeah. Well, there's a book which I've been meaning to write for some time called Reign of Ruin, which is about the American bombing of Japan, which I wanted to add to my book on the bombing war, which I wrote more than 10 years ago now. But the editor said, no, book's too long, which it was. And I had all the stuff, but I hadn't got time to put it together. So I thought the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Tokyo and so on was a good idea to write it. So it's a short book, which really analyzes, I think, a critical factor in the Second World War in general, which is what I call the radicalization of warfare. The fact that you start off thinking, I'm going to wage war in conventional ways and so on, and you end up dropping an atomic bomb on a civilian city. How do you get there? And I think my book on the bombing of Japan is one way of understanding how easy it is to slip from an initial commitment to a more radical commitment to how you wage war.
And that does seem to be an especially important issue to understand. I mean, if war is going to be with us forever, the most we can do perhaps is mitigate the impact and prevent the radicalization of wars when they do begin. That does seem to. What's your basic hypothesis of why wars get radicalized?
Well, because you want to win. And you're finding difficulty in winning, and the cost to your home population is becoming greater and greater, and you wonder whether they'll continue to fight, which was a worry for the American leadership in the summer of 1945. And so you hunt around for a way of accelerating the end. And, in the end, you will think that saving your own population is better than worrying about the population you're about to drop an atomic bomb on.
Yes, well, that does seem to have some lessons for us today, doesn't it?
It does, sadly.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's been a real pleasure and an honour to speak with you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.